March 31, 2015, and I am JTG, James Thomas Green. I'm in the car, parked right outside the Ridge rehab facility where Dad is undergoing rehab. Still got a cold. Not as bad as it was, but still not great. And so mixed messages on Dad. He's still hallucinating. And the question is this the start of dementia? Or is this a drug interaction? Is this sleep deprivation? Is it something else? Is it neurological damage? And they're going to start putting him through a lot of tests, CAT scans, blood draws, all kinds of exams. And apparently they're going to consult a psychiatrist as well. And we're going to try to figure out what's going on with Dad. It could be a combination of things too. But my biggest fear is that this is the start, or at least, if not the start, the point at which Dad starts getting a little too far gone. Well, define the terms. When Dad starts becoming not of sound mind. I don't think he's quite there yet, because he's aware of where he is. He knows what, but he gets confused. It's not as bad as the other night when he was thinking he was in a, he was hallucinating that the nurses were armed goons coming to kill him. Or the next morning, a few hours later, when he was afraid that he was in a crematorium, and apparently at 9 o'clock they were supposed to take him in and give him his bath, and he was convinced they were taking him into a gas chamber or an oven to burn him alive because he was in a crematorium. So it's disturbing to think that, I hope that whatever that was is a passing thing, but he is 88. That runs in the family. His father was pretty far gone by 82. I didn't know it. I heard tales about Dad's father, Thomas Alton Green. There was one story that I've heard, and I don't know the details, that supposedly he started wandering the neighborhood and he just walked into somebody's house. They didn't know who he was, and he just sat down on the couch and started crying. I hope Dad doesn't get to that point. I don't know why he was crying. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was sad. Maybe he was a little of both. I didn't know my grandfather was even sick. I found out when I was transferred to Guam, and Dad apparently did not want my mother to tell me that my grandfather had died, or even that he was sick. But Mom apparently defied him, but it was kind of a strange way to defy him. I got a sympathy card in the mail. It said, "In sympathy," and on the inside there was a clipping of his obituary. And I remember looking at it, and it was like, so it didn't even really register. And since I was the guy I was in the Coast Guard, and I was the yeoman, and I was sitting there, I distribute the mail, and I saw it was a letter for me, so I opened it up, and I remember saying to my supervisor, Yeoman First Class Kennedy, "My grandfather just died. I just found out my grandfather died." And he was like, "Oh?" And I really had no emotional reaction at all because it was such out of the blue. And I really hadn't interacted much with my grandparents for a long time. They, unfortunately, they were not really too enamored with our wing of the family. They didn't like my mother, I don't think. And that dislike for my mother carried over to me. And so, at least that's how I interpret things. Plus, it was like, my grandmother especially was a religious, super religious fanatic. That's the only word for it. I remember her coming over and, she wouldn't ask us how we were doing in school, what our friends were. I mean, it was like, hello children, let's talk about Jesus. Like you haven't even sat down. You're standing in the doorway and you're saying, hi, can we talk about Jesus? So, I never had much of a relationship with either of my grandparents on my father's side. But Dad, I don't know, maybe, I think I can take some credit anyway that Dad is still as aware of the world as he is, because, I try to keep him thinking. I don't let him get away with being sloppy when he uses the wrong words for things. For instance, when he calls the heater in the house, the house heater, he calls it the stove, or he was doing that for a while. And I knew what he meant after a while, but I made him use, you don't mean stove, you mean heater. And he would, for a long time, he kept calling it the stove. And I kept saying, no, it's not the stove, it's the heater. And, other people in the family might go, oh, why worry about it? He's old, let him. But I think when you start I believe that if I let him get lazy, and he starts using the wrong words, then his mind, he may know what he wants to say, but if he doesn't use the right words, he won't recall them when he needs to. For example, here's another example, and this is a more recent one. When Dad was in the hospital, when Dad was being taken away the second time recently, the last time by the paramedics, he kept asking for his burp bag because he was nauseated. Now, the thing is nobody calls it a burp bag but him. He meant barf bag. And I kept saying, Dad, it's not a burp bag, it's a barf bag. As in, barf. And it took me a long time. I kept pushing him, and it doesn't stick because just a little while ago he was asking for his burp bag. And it might seem a minor thing, except the paramedics did not know what he was asking for. What's a burp bag? Now you can maybe make the argument, oh, well, they should just know, barf, burp, same thing. No, they didn't know. Not one of the half dozen paramedics there knew what he meant when he said burp bag. And again, that might seem a minor thing, but if you start using the wrong words, it's easier for people to dismiss you as incompetent, not knowing what you're talking about, senile. And he's got that real problem right now because I think most people they don't have someone like me around to point him out that he's still there mostly. Truck almost ran into a car. Oh well. So, I don't know. On one hand, I'm wondering if we're into the final days. I'm wondering if this is senility. Well, I'm anticipating that in the next couple of weeks, these tests are going to show something. For example, is his brain starting to shrink? Does he have a lot of calcium, but cholesterol film build up inside his blood vessels in his brain? It's the same kind of thing that happens in the heart it causes a heart attack. But when it happens in the brain, it causes the brain to shrink. And that's one symptom of, I'm not sure if that's an Alzheimer thing or it's just senility in general. So, and find out about that. And, you know, this is not necessarily that this is a permanent thing. These hallucinations seem to be recent, but I don't know, maybe he's been having them for a while and just nobody's noticed. Maybe when he's in bed screaming in the night, as he often does, not screaming, but shouting, but he's done this for years. He'll be laying in bed and all of a sudden I'll hear, "Ah, shit!" or "fuck!" "No!" You know, and he's having some kind of a nightmare. And how many of those may have been hallucinations? But if he's going to really start to hallucinate, then we're going to have to do more for him. For example, if he were home alone and he started hallucinating, he might hurt himself. He might go outside. Fortunately, he stopped walking out onto the front porch in his underwear. He was doing that for a long time. You know, he'd go out on the front porch to get the mail in his underwear in the middle of the day. And I remember one time I'm sitting in the chair, I'm watching Dad get up. He walks to the front door, opens the front door, and walks out on the front porch, comes back in, closes the door, and I said, "Dad, why, you really shouldn't be walking out on the front porch in your underwear." And I just watched him do it. And he looks at me and says, "I did not just walk out on the front porch in my underwear." It's like, oh, yeah, it's like you're wearing your underwear and you just walked onto the front porch. I saw you, and you're telling me you didn't. So there's recovery involved in that. And yeah, in my life, I think I need to contemplate more what my life's about to be like if Dad dies. I've been thinking about it for a while. I've signed up for classes for the summer. Well, one class. That's 3 hours a day. I think maybe 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. I may drop it though. You know, in favor of combination of spending time with Dad and getting some of my economic plans going, art sales, video production, and so forth. Because when Dad dies, I'm going to need an income source pretty quick. And I now think that that's something that's doable. Depending on how my brother and sister react. If they're not like demanding I get out in 3 weeks, which could happen. Hopefully not. So that could be. I consider my brother and sister to be probably the greatest post-Dad's death problems. But we'll see. Hopefully Dad's around for a few more years and I'm fully independent when it happens. And yes, it does, for me, seem a little odd to have to be thinking about such things as how am I going to live indoors once Dad dies. I'm not as concerned as I would have been a few months ago. Because I think I'm sort of reaching a point where a lot of my life starting to coalesce, and I know I'm being obscure, and I'll talk more about that in another message. But